The night they gave me that award and the grant I had earned from my charity work, I came home proud. I walked through my own front door holding the plaque in my hands. My daughter-in-law grabbed it, demanded I hand over every dollar of that money. I refused. She looked me dead in the eye and said the words I will never forget. "You are not real family in this house." My son stood right there, said nothing, so I left. What happened next? They never saw it coming. I have spent my whole life working with these hands, 35 years, turning wrenches as a mechanic in Dorchester, Boston. And that trade taught me one thing above all else. You can tell exactly what something is worth by the weight of it in your grip. A solid engine block, a cracked axle, a man's word given and kept. I know the gap between something that holds and something that merely appears to. That plaque they handed me that evening was nearly weightless. Mounted wood with a brass plate maybe 12 inches across. Not much to look at on its own. But when the woman from the Boston Foundation set it in my hands and the crowd inside the Strand Theater rose into applause, I felt the full meaning of what I was holding. It was not the hardware that had weight. It was everything behind it. 3.5 decades of showing up, of doing the work of being the kind of man who does not look away when someone needs help. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where real pain, hard choices, and the long road back to dignity get their proper telling. Before we begin, drop a quick comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something about knowing people are settled in across so many different places that makes a story like this one feel like it travels the way it's supposed to. A quick note: some elements of this story have been dramatized for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific living persons is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. That plaque carried the full weight of Pruitt's garage in my hands. Every gearbox I pulled apart at no charge. Every hot meal we set out on those long tables in the back room. 12 years of showing up distilled into something I could tuck under one arm and walk through a door with. Loretta was sitting in the third row. The moment I caught her face in that crowd, her lips pressed shut, the thing she does when tears are threatening and she refuses to let them win in public. 58 years old, and that hasn't changed one bit. 36 years I have been in love with that woman, and not a single one of them made me weary of watching her fight to stay composed. The grant came attached to the plaque. $30,000 from the Boston Foundation, earmarked specifically for Pruitt's garage and the programs we ran out of it. The representative laid out the terms plainly over the microphone. Restricted funds, equipment supplies, upkeep of the facility, growing the programs. Not a personal payout, not a bonus. A resource meant to keep doing what we were already doing. I made the drive home with the plaque across the back seat, and Loretta next to me, her hand settled on my arm the way it has been for 3 decades. We went back and forth about what needed attention first. The alignment rack had been sticking for months. Maybe a new chest freezer for the soup kitchen side. I was still on the subject of the freezer when I pulled up to the house. Colin was stretched out on the couch, television running. He glanced over when we came through the door, gave one nod, turned back to the screen. 32 years old, and he occupied that house like a man who had quietly concluded it was already his. Sabrina was in the kitchen doorway, with both arms folded tight across her chest. She had a particular gift for standing in a room so that you understood immediately she had been there a while expecting you. "Let me see it," she said. I extended the plaque toward her. She took it, flipped it over, put it on the counter, the way you put down an envelope you have no intention of opening. "The $30,000, she said. "We need to discuss that." "There is nothing to discuss," I told her. "Those are restricted funds. They go directly into the garage accounts equipment community programs. That is the entire purpose." She said Nadia's school expenses keep climbing. Sabrina's voice had that practiced evenness she used when she had already run the conversation in her head and decided how it would go. Private tutoring, after-school programs. "We are struggling. Then we look for another way to address that," I said. "That money does not belong to me to hand out. It belongs to the programs." Sabrina's jaw went tight. "You are sitting on $30,000, and you're going to tell me your own grandchild comes last. That is precisely what I'm telling you." Colin reached for the remote and bumped the volume up 3 notches. Sabrina's arm swung out and snatched the plaque from the counter. For half a heartbeat, I figured she just wanted another look. Then she drove it down against the edge of the counter, and it split across the center. She took hold of both halves and wrenched. The wood came apart with a sound like a limb tearing from a tree. She let the pieces fall to the floor between us. You want to write checks for strangers while your own people are going under, she said, her voice dropping into the low register that cuts deeper than any raised one. You are not real family in this house, old man. You never were. I looked at her face, then down at the 2 broken halves on the tile. The brass plate had buckled but stayed in one piece. 12 years of Saturday mornings, lying face down on my kitchen floor. Colin rose from the couch. I turned to face him, and for one beat I was certain he would speak up. He looked at me, then at Sabrina, then at the floor. He moved past us both and disappeared down the hall. The bedroom door pulled shut behind him. No slam. A quiet click. I did not leave that kitchen for a long time. Loretta came around the counter and went to her knees on the tile. Bad knees and 58 years old, and she went down without a moment's pause. She gathered up one half of the plaque, then the other. Her hands were trembling not from anger. I can always tell the difference. Watching my wife kneel on that floor and collect the remains of 35 years of work, I found myself without a single word to offer her. By the time I sat down at the kitchen table, she had already arranged things without anyone asking both halves of the plaque, set parallel. The bent brass plate positioned flat in the gap between them. The wood fragments lined up neatly along the edge like she was handing me a place to start. She slipped off to bed without saying goodnight, not out of anger, but because she understood I needed the silence around me. Fixing things is what I have done all my life. Engines, transmissions, brake lines, exhaust systems. I have coaxed life back into motors that other mechanics dismissed as scrap. I know how damaged things are supposed to come back together, but sitting alone at that table at 11 at night, I could not find a single starting point. Pruitt's garage had its beginning in a rented bay on Baudouin Street, winter of 2012. I had just walked away from my career, and Loretta said I would go to pieces rattling around inside 4 walls. So I leased the bay, cleared it out, and began doing free repairs for neighbors who could not stomach dealership prices. 6 months in, we had more work than we could handle. 2 years on, we had built out the soup kitchen, in the rear brought in 4 donated upright freezers, and put together a rotation of 35 volunteers. What sat on that table was 12 years of 7-day weeks. Every dollar funneled back into the neighborhood, instead of a personal account. I was still staring at the pieces when the floorboard in the hallway shifted. Nadia came through the kitchen doorway in her pajamas. 6 years old, slight for her age, with Loretta's dark eyes and the habit of taking in a whole room before committing to a single step. Her art supply box was wedged under one arm. A roll of clear packing tape dangled from her wrist like a bangle. "You're supposed to be asleep," I said. "I know," she said. She came to the table regardless. She put the art box down, dragged out the chair beside mine, and hauled herself up into it, the way children that age do. All effort and determination. She studied the broken pieces for a moment, then tore a strip of tape free with her teeth, the same way she had watched Loretta do it. "Grandpa," she said, "hold that piece still." I held it still. She ran her thumb along the tape over the crack, pressing it flat from one end to the other, with the same total focus she brought to her drawings. The tip of her tongue crept out slightly. She pulled another strip, angled it across the first, pressed it down. No hurrying, no cutting corners. "Other piece now," she said. I slid the second half into position. She ran tape across the back, then the front, then laid 2 more strips over the seam, because that was how she decided it should be done. The plaque was never going to look the way it had. The fracture ran straight across the center, and the tape picked up the kitchen light so you could see it from the far end of the room, but it was whole again. Nadia stood it up against the sugar bowl and considered it, head tilted to one side. "It's still good," she said. "Yeah," I said. "It is." She turned toward me, then wearing the look children get when they have held something back long enough and are ready to say it. "Grandpa, don't be sad. Going to the garage with you is my favorite thing in the whole week. Every Saturday I open my eyes and think today is garage day, and that thought alone makes the rest of it easier." I drew her in close, and she settled against my side, the way she always did, her head resting against my ribs. "You're the best family I've got," she said. I mean it. My throat was not steady enough to answer her immediately. The person who came to mind was Bevelyn Crane, our neighbor from next door. Bevelyn was 55 and had been giving her time to Pruitt's garage since we were barely into our 2nd year. She held down the intake desk. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, kept the volunteer board updated on the whiteboard in the back office, and hauled me out to the parts supplier on Route 1 whenever my truck decided it had other ideas. Not once had she asked me why I kept at it, never hinted I ought to ease up, never suggested the whole operation was more than one man should take on. She simply came back every week, every year, without needing to be persuaded. I thought of her because Nadia brought that same quality to mind. Not the face, not the years, but something in the steadiness of her presence. Certain people make whatever room they're in feel more settled just by arriving. I heard Loretta step into the doorway. I didn't turn around. I knew Loretta was there by the particular silence she brings with her, the way her breathing settles when she goes still. She stood for a moment, taking in the two of us, and then I heard her footsteps move back down the hall. A long pause followed, and I understood she was standing in the dark outside their door, doing what she has always done when something lands hard on her breathing, through it steadying herself until she can carry the weight of it. Nadia had gone slack against my arm by the time I brought her back to bed. I pulled the blanket up under her chin and stood there in the dark watching her for longer than was necessary. When I came back to the kitchen, the plaque was still leaning against the sugar bowl. I picked it up and turned it in my hands. The tape job was imperfect strips, uneven, slightly off angle, the whole repair carried out by a 6-year-old with a borrowed roll of packing tape. And yet the thing held. The damage was plain to see, and it held all the same. 30 years of work, I thought, and it took a child to remind me it was still worth something. There was something wrong in that house. Not a new wrong, an old one, the sort that accumulates inside the walls over years, until one night it collapses all at once. I had allowed it to go on too long. I had convinced myself that patience was interchangeable with wisdom, and I had been wrong about that for more years than I cared to count. I placed the plaque back down and switched off the kitchen light. Tomorrow I decided things would start to shift. I want to say something about money and silence because most people treat them as unrelated. For 10 years, I covered every bill in that house. Electric, gas, water, internet, the full utility load on a 4-bedroom home, which in winter alone runs close to $600. Property taxes paid on time. When the kitchen drain backed up in February of 2018, I called the plumber and settled the bill. I replaced the water heater the following spring without prompting because it needed doing, and I was the one who noticed. I kept no running ledger because I told myself that was not the kind of man I intended to be. A father who tallies what he gives is a man who has already begun pulling back. That was my belief. Looking at it now, I can see that what I was actually doing was constructing a wall between myself and an honest reckoning, one paid invoice at a time. When I finally sat down and added the figures during those quiet hours after Nadia went back to bed, the total came to just over $63,000 across 10 years. No word of thanks. No acknowledgement that the lights stayed on because of me. Loretta asked me once, about 3 years into it, why I had never sat Colin down and spoken plainly about what I was shouldering. I told her I believed actions spoke louder than words. I told her a man who has to announce his generosity has already made it about himself. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Kenneth, silence doesn't teach. It just lets things grow in the dark." She was right. I didn't admit it then. I am admitting it now. The morning after Nadia repaired the plaque, I packed 2 bags. Work clothes, tools, the folder of garage paperwork from the filing cabinet, my shaving kit. Loretta packed 1 bag without being asked and placed it by the door alongside mine. That was the entire conversation we needed to have on the matter. Bevelyn Crane was out on her porch with her coffee when I came through the door with the first load. She was a solid woman, Bevelyn, the kind who reads a situation quickly and doesn't burn time on questions that won't change anything. She set her mug down when she saw the bags. "Need a hand," she said. "Got a heavy one in the back," I said. She came off the porch and picked up the box without waiting to be asked again. We loaded it into her Subaru, and she drove me over to the garage and helped me get everything inside. Then she drove back home. She did not ask where I was going, or why, or how long I planned to be there. She had been walking through the door of Pruitt's garage on Tuesday and Thursday mornings for 10 years without needing an explanation. This was no different. The room at the back of the garage was spare, a cot, a radiator, a window that looked out onto the alley behind Beaudoin Street. Loretta set her things on the shelf above the cot and put her reading glasses on the windowsill, and it became home the way practical people make something home without any ceremony required. 14 days later, the power at the house went out. Colin called at 7 in the morning, early enough that I knew Sabrina had planted the idea the night before, and he had spent the hours between then and now working up the nerve. His voice had that particular tightness he gets when he is performing an anger he doesn't quite feel. You shut off the power, he said. I stopped paying for it, I said. Those are different things. We have a child in that house. She, Nadia, is here with us, I said, which wasn't true yet, but it would be, and we both understood that. You can't just abandon your family, Colin said, and his voice caught on the word abandon in a way that told me Sabrina had coached him to use that exact word. That is elder neglect. That is abandonment. I can report you. I need to be precise about this because it matters. Under New York social services law, elder abandonment requires two specific things. First, that the person accused holds a designated caregiver role with a legal obligation to the elderly individual. Second, that the elderly individual is unable to care for themselves. I was 60 years old in sound health, living by my own choice in a space I had selected, managing my own money, and running a 12-year-old community organization. Colin had no legal standing and no factual ground to stand on. He was wielding a serious term the way people do when they have exhausted all their real ones. Colin, I said, I own that house. The deed carries my name on it. You might want to look at it before you start making calls. The silence on his end had a different quality than his usual ones. This one had the sound of something going flat. The water went out too, he said, quieter now. Call the utility company, I said. Open your own account. You're 32 years old. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the workbench. Loretta was at the small table in the corner with her tea watching me. She hadn't spoken a word during the call because she never puts herself into conversations between me and Colin. That restraint is one of the 1,000 ways she is wiser than I am. How did he sound? She asked. Scared, I said. Not angry, scared. She nodded and wrapped both hands around her mug. That evening, the phone rang again. Unknown number. I let it ring for 3 full cycles before the name resolved in my contacts. Sabrina Holt. She was calling from a number I didn't recognize, which meant she had called from somewhere other than her own phone, which meant she had thought carefully about whether I would answer and chosen to route around that. I set the phone back on the workbench and let it ring out. Whatever she needed to say, she wasn't prepared to say it straight, and I had given 10 years of space to things that were never said straight. That particular kind of accommodation was finished. Loretta does not carry other people's business. 36 years of marriage and I have never once heard her repeat something that wasn't hers to repeat. And I have never seen her use what she knows as a lever. So, when she came back from the grocery store that morning and sat down at the table in the back room of the garage without unpacking a single bag, I knew before she found the words that whatever she had to tell me was going to cost us both something. She set her keys on the table. She folded her hands. She looked at the wall for a moment, the way she does when she is choosing her words, with the same care she used to give to medication decisions back when she was still nursing. I heard Sabrina at the supermarket, she said. Heard her how she was in her car in the parking lot. The window was cracked. Sabrina hadn't bothered to lower her voice. I let Loretta finish before I said anything. She delivered it the way she delivers everything, flat, and ordered nothing added, nothing softened, just what happened in the sequence it happened. Sabrina had been talking to a collections firm. Not a bank. She still had a relationship with a third-party agency, the kind that enters the picture only after a creditor has given up waiting and sold the account off. When debt travels that far, the situation has been deteriorating for a long time. The figure Loretta had caught through that cracked window was $47,000. I sat with that for a moment. The card is in her name alone, Loretta said. Not a joint account. Colin's name isn't on it anywhere. He'd have no reason to go looking and no legal right to see it, even if he did. That last part mattered more to me than the dollar figure. Federal credit law is clear on this: one spouse carries no automatic obligation for debt. The other spouse holds in their own name, and they cannot access that account without the cardholder's consent. Sabrina had been running up charges for 3 years on a card that was invisible to Colin by design. That was not a crime, but it was a structure built for hiding, and the shape of that structure told me more about what I was dealing with than any dollar amount could. What was she buying? I asked. Designer things, Loretta said. Bags, clothes. The collections agent had cited specific items on the call. Sabrina had cycled through several versions of an explanation. They were gifts, then they weren't. Then she could account for it. She couldn't. She was in tears before it ended. The agency told her they would begin reporting to the credit bureaus within 10 days, unless she established a payment plan, and that if there was a family member with financial resources available to her, This was the moment to have that conversation. I pushed back from the table and went to stand at the window that faced the alley. A pigeon was working at something near the drain. I stood there longer than I had any reason to. There were signs I had walked right past. The way Sabrina was always first to the mail slot, moving through that stack of envelopes with the speed of someone who knows what she's looking for, slipping certain pieces into her pocket before the rest ever made it to the counter. The way her whole frame stiffened when a number she didn't recognize came up on her phone. Not the low-grade dread of someone anticipating bad news, but the tight, controlled response of someone who knows exactly who is calling and why. I had registered both of those things and tucked them into folders labeled something more comfortable. She guards her mail. She doesn't like strange numbers. I handed her reasons she never once gave me. On the phone, she had told the agent that her father-in-law was a man of means. She said she was working on it, Loretta told me. Working on it, not asking for it, not hoping it might come through, working on it as though it were a task with steps and a timeline. The $30,000 she had demanded the night of the ceremony was not a desperate reach. It was a calculated move. I came back and lowered myself into the chair. Colin has no idea, I said. No idea, Loretta confirmed, and Sabrina intended to keep it that way, provided she could get hold of the money through some other door first. I pulled open the drawer in the small table we used as a desk in the back room. Beneath the garage's insurance papers and the volunteer schedule folders was the property deed I had carried with me when we left the house. I drew it out and set it between us. The paper had yellowed slightly at the margins. Kenneth Earl Pruitt, 1990. The year sat clearly in the upper right corner, 2 years before Colin came into the world. Loretta studied the deed. Then she looked across at me. What are you going to do? Kenneth. I dragged my thumb along the document's edge, feeling the faint ridge the notary seal had left in the paper 34 years back. Every repair job has a moment like this. When you have worked through the diagnosis, when you understand precisely what failed and precisely what the remedy requires, you haven't lifted a wrench yet. But the guesswork is behind you. From here, it is only execution. I'm going to finish what needs finishing, I said. Nothing more than that. I creased the deed along its fold lines and pressed it into the inside breast pocket of my jacket, close enough that I'd feel it if I reached for anything. Loretta extended her hand across the table and covered mine briefly. Then she rose and began unpacking the grocery bags, lifting each item out and placing it on the shelf with movements that were slow and deliberate. The movements of a woman who has resolved that the most useful thing she can offer right now is the certainty that the pantry is stocked for whatever follows. I watched her and thought about 36 years together and what it means to stand beside someone who does not step back. There is a specific kind of anger that was never born in the man who is carrying it. I have recognized it before men walking into the garage, already wound tight hands balled before they have spoken a single word. Their eyes find you, but they are aimed at somebody else. Someone packed that fury in and sent them on their way, and they drove the distance with it riding along, and now they are at your door, and they need somewhere to unload it. Colin arrived at Pruitt's garage at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. I know the time precisely because we were 40 minutes into the lunch service, and I had only just helped Mrs. Obiora, a 70-year-old regular, who claimed the far end of the third table by the window every week, get her tray positioned after the arthritis in her right hand made carrying it painful. I had barely straightened up when the side door banged open. Colin took in the space from the threshold, the way someone surveys a scene they have already decided to resent. His gaze swept the folding tables, the people bent over their meals, the volunteers working the rows with trays and pitchers. His jaw was locked. His arms hung at his sides, but nothing about him was loose fingers half-curled the hands of a man who has been squeezing and releasing them the entire drive over. Bevelyn was stationed at the serving counter moving soup from the pot into bowls. She clocked the door, registered Colin in a single look, and returned to her work with no change in her face. That was her way: absorb everything, betray nothing. Wait for the situation to tell you when it needs you. Colin came through the tables toward me. The diners kept eating. 12 years of all manner of arrivals through that door had taught them to stay focused on their own trays until events made a demand on them. You think this is how your time should be spent? Colin's voice carried, and the two volunteers closest to us both slowed what they were doing. Keeping strangers fed while your own son is sitting in the dark. We're in the middle of lunch service, I said. Bring your voice down. I won't bring my voice down. He moved a step closer. The flush in his face had gone somewhere deeper than anger, something rawer underneath it. I could hear Sabrina in the architecture of those sentences and the way they landed too cleanly, too practiced. These were words that had been rehearsed in a kitchen across Dorchester and driven here for delivery. You've got $30,000 in a foundation account, and you're out here feeding strangers. What kind of father makes that choice? The kind who honors his commitments. Your commitment is to family. His palm came down across the serving table hard enough that the stacked trays beside it shuddered. Your son, your grandchild. Not every worn-out stranger who wanders in off Bowdoin Street. The room pulled very quiet, not silent. The kitchen exhaust fan still pushed air someone's chair, shifted at the far end of the room, but the conversational noise had drained out completely. 35 people were staring at their food and taking in every word. Mrs. Obiora set down her spoon. She reached over and righted the small cup of juice that had tipped when Colin's hand struck the table. She did it without raising her eyes, the calm, unhurried motion of a woman long practiced at restoring what others send sideways. Colin's arm swung out. A tray at the table's edge went airborne. The bowl it carried hit the concrete floor, and shattered soup fanning out in a wide slick across the ground. Bevelyn put down her ladle. I looked at my son, 32 years old, planted in the middle of a room full of people who had come through that door because they had no other options. Surrounded by 12 years of accumulated work, with soup on the floor, and his chest heaving, and a fury in his eyes that had never really belonged to him in the first place. "Are you done?" I said. His mouth moved without anything coming out. "Then, pick up what you knocked over," I said. "These people are still waiting on their lunch." Colin held his ground for 4 or 5 seconds that stretched out considerably longer than that. Something crossed his face, not remorse, not quite, but the first distant relative of it. The moment when a man hears himself as others are hearing him, and doesn't fully recognize what he's hearing. Then he turned and walked back through the tables and out the side door which swung closed behind him. He did not pick anything up. Bevelyn came around the counter with a roll of paper towels, crouched without being asked, and started working on the soup. One of the other volunteers brought a fresh bowl over. Mrs. Obiora retrieved her spoon and carried on. I went to the utility closet for the mop. By the time the lunch service had wound down, the last person had cleared out, and the tables were folded and stacked against the wall. It was past 4 Zizuro. Bevelyn poured 2 cups from the pot on the back burner and placed one on the workbench beside me without comment. She dragged a stool to the other side of the bench and sat down, holding her own cup in both hands. We stayed like that for a while. The garage had the quietness it settles into after a long, full day. A particular exhaling stillness, the kind a space takes on after it has held that many people, and then let them all go. "He's in pain," Bevelyn said at last. Not a defense of him. An observation stated plainly the way she stated most things. "I know," I said. "Doesn't make it right." "No," I said. "It doesn't." She nodded and drank her coffee. Outside, the light along Bowdoin Street had turned amber with the late afternoon, the way it does in January when the sun goes down fast, and the whole block looks like it was photographed decades ago. That golden window that lasts maybe 20 minutes before the dark swallows everything. My phone vibrated on the workbench. I flipped it over. "Colin." I let it roll to voicemail and set it back down. A minute later, the notification came through. I hit play and held it to my ear. The voice on the message was nothing like the one that had filled the garage earlier. The heat had drained out of it, replaced by something lower and more calculated, which I have always found more dangerous than heat. "Dad, this is your last chance. Pay the bills or get out. That house is mine now anyway. You should think carefully about what happens next." I set the phone onto the bench. My hand went into the inside pocket of my jacket and found the edge of the deed through the paper. For the first time in several days, something close to a smile came over me. I called Leon Vargas on the drive over. Leon had been with the Area B3 Mattapan District Station for 19 years. We had crossed paths at a community board meeting. In 2014, he came to discuss the Neighborhood Watch program, and then stayed on afterward to help us carry tables back inside. He had come through the doors of Pruitt's garage 3 or 4 times over the years, usually around Thanksgiving, when we ran the big meal service. He was a direct man who understood that what the law required and what a situation deserved were not always pointing toward the same thing. When I laid out what I needed, he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Loretta rode in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap. She had been quiet since I told her we were headed back to the house. She didn't need to say much. After 36 years together, the silences between us carry their own kind of meaning. Colin and Sabrina were in the living room when we came through the front door. Colin on the couch, Sabrina standing behind him with her arms folded. They had the staged look of people who had been waiting and had already scripted how things would play out. Colin got to his feet when he saw us. "You got my message," he said. "I did," I said. I came into the room and laid my jacket over the armchair, the one my father had given us when Loretta and I married, which had been in this house for 31 years. I reached into the inside pocket, brought out the deed, and set it on the coffee table between us. Colin looked at it without touching it. "Kenneth Earl Pruitt," I said. "Recorded with the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds in March of 1990, 2 years before you were born, Colin. This house has been mine since before you existed, and it stays mine until I decide otherwise." "You can't throw us out," Sabrina said. Her voice had an edge to it, but underneath that edge was something that sounded like the opening stages of fear. "We live here. We have rights." "You have been living here as my guests," I said. "No rent paid, no lease signed. Under New York state law that makes you licensees, not tenants. The distinction is not a small one." The front door opened and Leon Vargas stepped in. He was in uniform, which I hadn't asked for, but which I understood completely. Some conversations go more smoothly when the authority in the room has a face you can see. "Evening," Leon said. He took in the deed on the table, looked at Colin, looked at Sabrina, then settled his gaze on me. "Mr. Pruitt walked me through the situation. I walked him through it. He listened without cutting in. When I finished, he picked up the deed, checked the recorded date, and placed it back on the table. 'Sir,' he said, directing it at Colin, 'do you have a lease agreement for this property?' Colin's jaw went tight. 'He's my father.' 'That's not what I asked.' 'Do you have a written lease?' 'No.' 'Any documented financial arrangement for your occupancy rent payments, anything like that?' 'He's been covering our bills for years,' Sabrina said. 'That's basically the same thing.' 'It is not the same thing,' Leon said, with the even patience of someone who has walked through legal distinctions in other people's living rooms many times before. 'A licensee occupies a property with the owner's permission, but without a formal tenancy agreement. The owner may revoke that permission. Mr. Pruitt is revoking it tonight.' Colin looked over at me. The rehearsed anger from the voicemail had gone. What remained was something rawer and younger and harder to sit with. 'You're actually doing this?' he said. 'You're throwing your own family out of the house.' 'You told me to get out,' I said. 'I'm reminding you whose name is on the paper. We have a child.' 'Nadia is welcome to stay,' I said. 'You and Sabrina need to make arrangements.' A sound from the staircase turned all of us around. Nadia was perched on the 4th step up from the bottom, pajamas on knees tucked to her chest, watching us through Loretta's dark eyes. She had been sitting there long enough to have caught most of it. Children always absorb more than the adults around them think to account for. Something moved through my chest that I don't have a clean name for. Not regret I had made the right call, and I knew it. But right calls are not always without cost. Looking at that child on the stairs, 6 years old, trying to piece together what the adults in her life were doing, I felt the full accumulated weight of every year I had put this off. I went to the stairs and sat down next to her. She leaned into my arm at once the way she always does, like something turning toward warmth. "Grandpa," she said, keeping her voice low. "Are you and Daddy fighting?" "We're having a serious conversation," I said. "Grown-up business, nothing for you to worry about. Is everybody going to be okay?" I put my arm around her. She was so small. "Go get your bear and your backpack," I said. "You're going to stay with Grandma and me for a little while. You can sleep in the room at the back of the garage. You always said you wanted to sleep there." She looked up at me. "The one with the window that faces the alley. That's the one." She thought it over with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to logistical decisions. Then she climbed the stairs to gather her things. Colin and Sabrina packed in a silence that had the texture of surrender. Leon waited until every last bag had been carried out. At the door, he shook my hand without a word. No parting speech, no commentary. And I was grateful for that. Loretta and I stood in the living room while the rest of it wrapped up. Colin's headlights dragged across the front window and then vanished, swallowed by the dark of the street, and Loretta moved to where I was standing. Not close enough to touch, just close enough that the warmth off her arm reached mine. Nadia appeared on the stairs, lugging her backpack, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm, and the art supply box she'd thought to grab, entirely on her own initiative. She peered through the window at the empty driveway. "Is the alley room warm?" she asked. "That's where we put the good radiator," Loretta told her. Nadia weighed this, nodded, and slipped her hand into Loretta's. I shouldered her backpack and killed the living room light behind us. The 3 weeks that followed Colin and Sabrina's departure were the stillest stretch of time we'd had in years. But not the kind of stillness that opens up when a house drains of people, that hollow, echoing quiet that bounces off bare walls and keeps score of every absence. This was something else. This was the quiet of things that have been broken a long time, finally beginning inch by inch to get less broken. Nadia took the alley room, the one with the reliable radiator, and the window looking out over the back of the building opposite. By the second day, she'd taped 3 of her drawings above the cot, which was all the announcement she needed to make. Every morning, Loretta would braid her hair at the little table in the back room, while Nadia made her way through a bowl of oatmeal and reported on whatever had been turning over in her head since she woke up. 6-year-olds rise with opinions already fully assembled, the right number of legs for insects to have, whether clouds are partial to certain shapes, what name she intended to give the pigeon that had taken up permanent residence near the alley drain. Kenneth, she had decided. She delivered this information with total gravity, and I told her that was a fine name for a pigeon. I drove her to Dever Elementary each morning at 7:45. The first week I'd gone into the front office and got the emergency contacts updated. Colin and Sabrina stayed on the list. But my name went first, something they'd arranged months back when their schedules began pulling in too many directions at once. Colin was logging 10-hour stretches at the firm. Sabrina's shifts reshuffled week to week. They'd put me first on that form without truly reckoning with what that role might one day require. The Wednesday of the 3rd week, my phone rang at 9:40. The screen read, Dever Elementary, Dorchester, Boston. I had it to my ear before the second ring completed. "Mr. Pruitt, this is Carol Waverly. I'm Nadia's teacher. I apologize for the call. Nadia took a fallout on the playground around 20 minutes ago. Her knee got scraped up fairly bad, and she's been upset and asking for you specifically. We've put calls into her parents and haven't reached anyone." 15 minutes, I said. "I'll be there." I relayed it to Loretta, and she was reaching for her coat while the words were still leaving my mouth. Mrs. Waverly met us up front, a compact woman somewhere in her 50s, reading glasses riding up on her forehead, carrying the unhurried take-stock manner of someone who has presided over classrooms for decades and has seen nearly every version of a hard day. She brought us back to the nurse's station, where Nadia sat on a padded table with a compress held to her knee. The crying had wound down, but the traces of it were still on her face until she saw us step through the door, and something in her settled. Both arms came up at once. I lifted her, and she buried her face against my shoulder. "I knew you'd come, Grandpa. I told Mrs. Waverly. I was always going to come," I said. Mrs. Waverly held the doorway while Loretta bent to look at the knee. A wide graze across the kneecap, real enough already cleaned, covered in gauze. But the nurse had noticed something else before we got there, and Mrs. Waverly raised it in a low voice while Nadia was absorbed in the graham crackers Loretta had pulled from her coat pocket. "The nurse flagged some bruising," Mrs. Waverly said quietly. "Arms and shins, more than one fall would account for. She thought the pattern was, she felt a family member ought to know." I glanced at Loretta across the top of Nadia's head. Loretta's face stayed level, but her hand, which had been resting light on Nadia's back, pressed down a little firmer. "We'll get her seen," I said. Mrs. Waverly gave a small nod. On our way out, she caught my arm. "She brings up the garage," she said, "every Monday for sharing. It never changes." We drove to Boston Medical Center on Morrissey Boulevard, a building I had passed 100 times over 12 years and scarcely registered. It is substantial sandy brick, a parking structure running alongside a covered entrance out front where people hunch into their collars against the wind coming off the street. I dropped them at the entrance and went to find a spot. By the time I reached the front desk, Loretta and Nadia had already been walked back to a room in the pediatric emergency wing. I handed over Nadia's details, date of birth, the insurance that was still current under Colin's employer plan, the name of her pediatrician. The intake nurse keyed it all in, passed me a visitor badge, and directed me down the hall. I found Nadia on the exam table, graham crackers still in hand, recounting to Loretta the plot of whatever book her class was moving through. She had that quality young children sometimes carry, the instinct that most things sort themselves out if you hold still and keep eating. The emergency physician came in, worked through the knee, and then without ceremony turned his attention to the bruising the school had noted. He put a few questions to Nadia in that low patient register good pediatric doctors use. How did she feel? Was anything hurting? What subject did she like best? Nadia told him about the pigeon named Kenneth. He smiled at that. He said he'd like to run some additional tests just to cover all the ground, and a nurse came in and drew blood from the inside of Nadia's elbow, while Loretta held her hand and told her to keep her eyes on the window. Nadia held together this time. She tracked a pigeon moving along the outside ledge and announced, "That one should be named Loretta." My wife laughed a real laugh unguarded. 3 weeks without that sound, and now here it was, like a window cracked open in a room that had been sealed too long. We went to the waiting area while the results came back. Loretta had her mending bag with her, as she always did, the way another person might carry a novel hands that needed to be doing something. She dug out a pair of Nadia's socks, the ones with the worn-through toe, and went at the hole with a needle, and that steady particular patience she gave to anything broken that could still be repaired. I sat next to her and kept my eyes on the hall. 40 minutes. The physician returned and he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a woman I hadn't seen before, measured unhurried, carrying the specific gravity of someone whose job it is to say hard things, and who has come to understand that plainness is a form of mercy. "Mr. and Mrs. Pruitt," she said. "I'm Dr. Elaine Chandra. I'm a hematologist on staff here. Would you come with me? I want to go over Nadia's blood work with you." Loretta set down the sock. She looked at me. I got to my feet. The corridor from the waiting room to the consultation room at the far end was short, not a long walk by any measure. I have covered far greater distances and retained nothing of them. Every foot of that hallway I will carry with me for whatever years remain. The consultation room itself was small, kept spare on purpose. A table, a handful of chairs, a box of tissues on the sill, left there by whoever set up the room because they knew exactly what it was for. Dr. Chandra settled across from us. The emergency physician looked in for a moment, then withdrew, which told me what I needed to know about whose ground we were on. She didn't ease into it. I was glad. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "Nadia's blood work has come back with some significant abnormalities. The white cell count, the platelet levels, the differential when you take all of it together, the picture is consistent with acute lymphoblastic leukemia." Under the table, Loretta's hand found mine. "I need you to hear what I'm going to say next," Dr. Chandra went on, "because it carries as much weight as the diagnosis itself. ALL is the most common leukemia in children, and it is also the most treatable form. Caught at this stage, the success rate for treatment runs between 85 and 90%. What comes next is the part of this story I have turned over in my mind more than any other, the moment when everything a man thought he understood about the people closest to him gets quietly rewritten. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you found out someone under your own roof had been carrying a secret that changed the meaning of everything, would you rather know the truth or have been left in the dark? That is not a small number. It is the majority of children who go through this treatment and come out the other side. I heard the words. I processed each one on its own, but something had shifted in the room, the way a space changes when glass breaks somewhere inside it. The temperature held, but the air felt altered in a way I could not name or explain. Loretta was asking questions. Her voice beside me was level and precise, the voice she had used for years as a nurse, when a family was frightened and someone needed to stay the clear-headed one in the room. What was the treatment protocol? How long was the induction phase and what did it involve? What side effects came with the medications? How soon would they have a read on whether Nadia was responding? Dr. Chandra worked through all of it. Induction was the opening phase, typically 6 to 8 weeks, during which Nadia would be admitted and receive the first rounds of chemotherapy aimed at pushing the leukemia into remission. If the response held, she would move on to outpatient consolidation. The induction phase meant staying in the hospital. Consolidation did not. Within the first 2 to 3 weeks of treatment, they would have a clearer sense of whether things were heading the right way. "What about insurance?" Loretta asked. "That's something I want to get ahead of," Dr. Chandra said. "Our social work team handles these situations regularly. If there's been any change in coverage job, loss, a gap in employment, anything along those lines, they can walk you through the Child Health Plus program. It's a state insurance program for children whose families don't qualify for Medicaid but need support with coverage. When there's a medical urgency, the application moves quickly. I'd like to connect you with someone from that team before you leave today." Loretta nodded and wrote something down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. I watched her hand move across the page and thought about all the years she had sat across tables, like this one, the one delivering the information, the one helping frightened families find solid footing. Now she was on this side of the table, and she was still the one holding things together. I had no words for what that cost her. I became aware that both of them had turned toward me. "Mr. Pruitt," Dr. Chandra said, with a gentleness that was not pity. "Do you have questions?" My mouth opened. Nothing came. I closed it. "Take whatever time you need," she said. I fixed my eyes on the tissue box sitting on the windowsill. Someone had decided to put it there. Someone had thought about what families do in rooms like this one, and made sure the box was within arm's reach, a small, deliberate act of readiness. That small thing was what undid what I had been holding together from the moment Dr. Chandra said the word leukemia. "She's 6 years old," I said. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "She names pigeons. She mends things with tape." Dr. Chandra held my gaze and did not look away. "I know," she said, "and we are going to do everything we can for her." Out in the hallway, after I put my back flat against the wall and let my eyes close, above me, the fluorescent lights ran their thin, barely audible hum, that sound you only catch when you stop moving in a hospital corridor. Loretta came and stood in front of me. I felt both my hands taken into hers. "Kenneth," she said, "look at me." I opened my eyes. Her face was what it had always been, 58 years old, the lines at the corners of her eyes that I had watched deepen over 3.5 decades. The particular set of her jaw that told me she had already decided what came next and was simply waiting for me to arrive at the same place. "She needs us right now," Loretta said. "Not tomorrow, right now." Something in my chest that had come loose and tilted found its way back to level. I pushed off the wall and stood straight. "Right now," I said. We went back to Nadia's room. She was watching a cartoon on the small television bolted in the corner, a blanket pulled to her waist. The IV line was taped to the back of her hand with a square of foam, padding the nurse had placed there so the tape wouldn't pull when she moved. She looked up when we walked in. "Grandpa, there's a dog on this show and he can talk," she said. "His name is Biscuit. That's a good name for a dog." "It is," I said. I pulled the chair up close to her bed and sat down. "It's a very good name." Loretta took the chair on the other side. We stayed. The cartoon ended and another started, and Nadia drifted off somewhere in the middle of it, her mouth slightly parted, one hand still loosely folded around the edge of her blanket. The IV machine kept its soft, steady rhythm. Beyond the window, Boston moved into evening lights coming on across the building, opposite the muffled pulse of the city, doing what cities do, which is continue regardless. I waited until Loretta's breathing had slowed, and I was certain she was dozing. Then I took out my phone. I scrolled to Bevelyn's name. It was 11:47. I pressed call. She picked up on the second ring. "Kenneth." Not a question, not surprise. Just my name spoken the way you say the name of someone you've been half expecting. "Bevelyn," I said, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't disturb them. "I'm sorry for the hour." "I need a ride," when she said. "Around 2 in the morning, maybe a little before." "I'll be outside," she said, and the call ended. I sat in that dark room with Nadia asleep on one side and my wife asleep on the other, and I began mapping out what needed to happen and in what sequence and how fast it could move. The same way I have always worked through a repair, not from the surface down, but out from the broken place one piece at a time, until the full shape of what it will take becomes visible. I called Colin the next morning at 7. He picked up on the first ring, which told me everything he hadn't slept. There are things you come to know about your children that you would rather not carry. One of them is the specific sound of their voice after hours of lying awake in the dark, trying to make numbers that won't add up. "Nadia is in the hospital," I said. "Boston Medical Center, I need you to come." 3 seconds of silence. Then, how bad, I gave him the diagnosis. I told him what Dr. Chandra had said about the treatment success rate. I told him that the induction phase was beginning that day and that she would be there for 6 to 8 weeks at minimum before they could judge whether to move forward. I gave him the full picture, straight the way you tell someone something that is going to reshape their life without cushioning, that only puts off the weight of it. Colin was quiet for a long time after I stopped talking. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Then I heard something I had not heard from him since he was very small. A sharp pull of breath, the kind that means a person is working hard not to come apart. "I'll be there," he said. His voice had broken clean through the middle. He arrived within the hour. He stood outside Nadia's room and looked at her through the glass for a long while before going in. She was awake by then, working through the hospital breakfast she had deemed acceptable on account of the small carton of orange juice she could open by herself. When Colin came through the door, she looked up and said, "Daddy, this juice is really good. You should try it." Colin sat on the edge of her bed and wrapped his arms around her and held on. What followed I did not see with my own eyes. I know it because Colin told me later, and because some of it I could piece together from what I understood about the people involved and the decisions they made when pressure left them no good options. Colin had no savings. He and Sabrina had been covering rent on a studio in Revere, and after the rent, the day-to-day costs and the debt Sabrina was already carrying, nothing was left over. When Nadia was admitted and the initial intake paperwork arrived, there were costs that insurance, even with a Child Health Plus application moving, would not immediately touch. Deposits, administrative fees, the gap between what was owed today and what coverage would eventually reach. Colin went to someone he should not have gone to. A man he knew through a shared acquaintance, the kind of arrangement that exists in every corner of a city like Boston, in the space between what banks will lend and what people find themselves needing. He borrowed $15,000. The interest rate was never stated in terms that translated to an annual percentage, which is itself, how you know, the number would have violated New York's criminal usury statute, the one that sets the felony threshold at 25% annually. He didn't tell me any of this at the time. He told me much later after everything had come apart, and he was finally speaking plainly. The money reached the wrong people within 2 weeks. I know the order of events because of what came after. Men started calling Colin's cell at hours that had nothing to do with business. Then they called the main number at the accounting firm in Midtown, where Colin worked, which was an altogether different matter. His employer had already issued 2 written warnings in the previous quarter, one for missing a client deadline, one for errors in a quarterly report that had taken after-hours correction to fix. The firm kept meticulous records. That was their way. When 2 men appeared on the office floor and asked for Colin by name, and his supervisor was required to escort them out, that was the end of it. His manager called him in that same afternoon. The termination was documented as conduct detrimental to the professional environment, which under New York at-will employment law required no further explanation. Colin carried his personal belongings out through the lobby in a cardboard box by himself. He didn't tell me that day. He came to the hospital and sat with Nadia and read to her from the book Mrs. Waverly had sent. He said nothing about the box sitting in the trunk of his car or the phone vibrating in his pocket. Loretta found the drawing on a Thursday afternoon. She was doing laundry in the small washroom at the end of the pediatric ward. The hospital had a family laundry room for parents staying long-term, 2 machines at the end of a hallway that smelled of detergent, and the specific weariness of people who had been sleeping in chairs. She was going through the bag of Nadia's clothes she'd brought from the garage, checking every pocket before loading the machine, the way she always did, because Nadia had a habit of tucking things away and forgetting them. In the inside pocket of Nadia's winter coat, the yellow one with the toggles that Nadia called her bumblebee coat, Loretta found a piece of paper folded into quarters. She spread it open on top of the washing machine. It was a crayon drawing, 5 figures standing in front of a building. The building had 2 large doors drawn open, and above the doors in careful child's lettering that leaned slightly to the right, the way Nadia's writing always leaned, were the words Pruitt's Garage. The 5 figures were different heights. The 2 tallest in the center had gray hair rendered in looping circular scribbles. The 2 middle-sized ones stood on either side of them. The smallest figure was at the center of all 4 arms, extended so the hands of that figure touched the hands of the figures on either side. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful slanting letters, My Family. Loretta stood in that laundry room, holding the drawing in both hands. The washing machine behind her lurched into its cycle, and the sound of water filled the small space. Her shoulders dropped first, then her chest. Then she lowered herself into the plastic chair against the wall, held the drawing flat against her front, and cried the way she cries, not loudly, not with her face buried in her hands, but with her whole body going still and the tears arriving without sound, which is somehow harder to witness than the kind that makes itself heard. A young nurse came in to use the other machine and stopped when she saw her. "Are you all right?" Loretta looked up. "My granddaughter drew this," she said, and held it out. The nurse studied it a moment. "She drew all of you," she said. "Yes," Loretta said. "She did." She refolded it carefully into quarters, slipped it back into her coat pocket, finished the laundry, and carried it down the hallway. She said nothing about it until that evening when Nadia was sleeping and the room had gone dim, and she reached into her pocket and placed the drawing on the tray table between us without a word. I sat with it for a long time. "She drew all of us," Loretta said quietly, "even when we weren't acting like it." I set it down. Outside of the window, Boston was sliding into dark lights coming on across the buildings one by one in the early evening, the way they do in March when the days are still short, and the dark arrives before you've braced for it. Something settled in me then. I began to understand what I had to do. Sabrina left on a Thursday evening. I know the sequence because Colin told me afterward, and because some of what he told me I could check against what I had already witnessed myself. I'm going to tell it the way it happened, not the way it felt, because the way it felt belongs to Colin and to Sabrina. I only have the edges. The call came to Sabrina at 4 in the afternoon. She was in the family waiting area, on the pediatric floor, 2 chairs from where Loretta sat reading. She stepped into the hallway to answer. The man on the other end represented the collection agency that had purchased her credit card debt, the same account at the same $47,000 that Loretta had overheard her arguing about in the supermarket parking lot on Morrissey Boulevard 2 months before. The account had been escalating since then. He told her that if she hadn't arranged a payment plan by end of business Friday, they would send a representative to her known locations to make contact in person. He read the locations out. The hospital was on the list. Sabrina knew what that meant. She had seen collection representatives show up before in the lobby of their apartment building in Revere when a different bill had gone too long unpaid. They didn't arrive quietly. They came in the way that drew eyes visible, loud, impossible to contain or ignore. She looked through the glass of Nadia's room, at her daughter lying in the bed, the IV line taped to the back of her hand, and she made a calculation that was wrong in its conclusion, but not in the love behind it. She believed that if she wasn't there, they wouldn't come, that if she went and dealt with it head on, she could keep it away from Nadia's floor, away from the nurses who knew their family by name, away from the room where her daughter was trying to get well. She wrote a letter to Colin on the notepad the hospital kept in the family lounge. She told him about the debt in full, the amount, the years it had accumulated, the card in her name, the things she had bought, and the reasons she had given herself at the time, and the reasons that didn't hold when she wrote them down in a hospital waiting room. She told him she was going to go handle it. She told him she was sorry. She left the notepad on his jacket on the chair. She walked out of the hospital at 5:17 in the evening. The meeting with the collection representative took place in the parking lot of a diner on American Legion Highway in Revere. She had requested it there neutral ground. She had said somewhere she could leave from. The man she met was not unkind, which turned out to be harder to manage than if he had been. He laid out the agency's position without softening it, without a minimum payment of $3,000. By Friday, the in-person contact protocol would go forward. She told him she didn't have $3,000. He said he understood. She asked whether any other arrangement was on the table. He said he would note the request in her file. She sat in her car in that parking lot for a long while after he drove away. The traffic on American Legion Highway moved past the windshield. She called 2 people she thought might be able to help. Neither could. She sat in the dark, then sat longer, and eventually drove back to the hospital because there was nowhere else to be, and her daughter was inside, and she couldn't make herself stay away. She didn't go back to the room. She went up to the 4th floor hallway and stood outside Nadia's door, looking through the narrow window at the side of the frame. Nadia was asleep. The monitors beside the bed traced their slow green lines. Loretta was in the chair next to the bed, head tilted back, also asleep. The room looked like a photograph of something she had broken and did not know how to put right. Colin came around the corner at the far end of the hallway, carrying 2 cups of water from the machine near the elevator. He stopped when he saw her. She turned. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Colin set both cups down on the floor against the wall, crossed the hallway, and took hold of her arms just above the elbows, the way you grip someone you're afraid is about to go down. And whatever had been keeping her upright gave way. She told him everything, not in any order, not with any composure, standing in the hallway outside their daughter's room at 9:45 at night, the fluorescent lights running overhead, a night nurse passing at the far end, neither of them caring. She told him about the card and the debt and the years of buying things she couldn't account for now, and the phone call that afternoon, and the parking lot on American Legion Highway, and the 2 people who hadn't been able to help, and the letter on his jacket, and why she had left, and why she had come back. Colin's hands tightened on her arms as she spoke. His jaw was working. When she finished, he didn't respond immediately. Not from coldness, not from anger, but from the particular stillness of a man who has just had the shape of the last 3 years rearranged in the span of 10 minutes and needs a beat to find his footing in the new arrangement. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "Because I was ashamed," she said, "and because I thought I could get it fixed before you ever had to know." Jess, he said her name the way he used to in the early days before the apartment, and the bills and the slow accumulation of distance that builds between two people who have stopped being honest with each other. "We have a daughter in that room." "I know," she said. The second word broke in her throat. "I know we do." He pulled her in, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in that hospital hallway while she cried, the way she had been holding back from crying for 3 years, without any effort to keep it quiet or contained. Her whole body shook with it. Colin held on with both arms, eyes wet, jaw set. He didn't let go. "We did this," he said into her hair. "Both of us." "Both of us," she said. They stood there for a long time. The night nurse moved past again at the far end and kept walking without slowing, which was its own kind of grace. "We have to go talk to my father," Colin said at last. Sabrina pulled back and looked at him, her face undone by it all. "He'll turn us away." "Maybe," Colin said, "but we're going anyway." He picked up both cups of water from the floor and handed her one. She took it. They walked back down the hallway together toward the room where Kenneth and Loretta were sleeping, and Colin knocked on the door at 2:37 in the morning, and I opened it and found the two of them standing there in the fluorescent light. I knew before a word had been spoken that something had finally cracked open that needed to crack. "Dad," Colin said, nothing left in his voice but the thing itself. "Can we come in?" I stepped back and held the door. The room was small for 4 people, and a conversation of this size. Earlier in the evening, when Loretta and I had settled in for the night, I had pulled 2 chairs in from the hallway, so there was enough seating, as long as nobody needed room to pace. Colin and Sabrina sat on the edge of the second bed. Nadia's room had a fold-out for family, and Loretta sat in her chair beside Nadia's bed, and I positioned myself near the window, because I have never been able to hold still when something that matters is being said. Bevelyn was in the corner chair near the door. She had been there since 2 hours in the morning, when she had driven me back from the meeting with Dr. Chandra and stayed on without being asked. Colin and Sabrina hadn't registered her when they came in. People caught in their own emergency rarely notice who else is in the room, and Bevelyn had a way of going quiet in a space not hiding, just settling, occupying precisely as much room as she needed, and no more. Colin spoke first. He told it without the anger this time, which made it both easier and harder to hear, depending on the part. He walked through the accounting firm, the written warnings, the cardboard box, and the trunk of his car. He covered the money he'd borrowed and who he'd borrowed it from, and what had unfolded when the repayment didn't come on schedule. He talked about Sabrina's letter on his jacket in the hallway and what she'd told him. When he finished, he looked at me directly for the first time since walking through the door. "Dad, I'm asking you to help Nadia. I have no right to ask, but I'm asking." I looked at my son for a moment. 32 years old. The box in the trunk. The money borrowed from the wrong man. The debt his wife had been carrying in silence for 3 years in an account he'd never seen. The voicemail he'd left me telling me to get out of my own house. All of it was in the room with us. I didn't pretend otherwise. Then I went to the small cabinet beside my cot. I had been sleeping in the recliner while Loretta took the fold-out. I opened the bottom drawer, took out a manila folder, carried it back, and laid it on the tray table between us. Colin looked at it without reaching for it. "Open it," I said. He opened it. Inside was a document from Boston Medical Center, a treatment agreement for a pediatric patient signed and dated 4 days earlier. Beneath it, a payment receipt for the initial deposit on Nadia's induction protocol. Below that, a printed email from Dr. Chandra's office confirming the treatment schedule and the financial arrangement that had been put in place. And beneath that, a bill of sale for a 2007 Chevy Silverado pickup truck sold to a private buyer on Blue Hill Avenue, signed and notarized for $8,500. Colin lifted each page, set it down, and moved to the next. His hands were steady. His breathing was not. "The truck," he said. "It's sold it the morning after I spoke to Dr. Chandra," I said. A man on Blue Hill Avenue had been after it for 2 years. I called him at 7 in the morning. He was there by noon. And the rest? Savings, I said. 22 years of setting something aside every month, which builds into something real if you don't spend it on things you can't afford. Colin put the last page down on top of the others and pressed his palm flat against the folder and held it there. The deposit is paid, I said. The treatment schedule is confirmed with Dr. Chandra. The Child Health Plus application went through yesterday. The social work team pushed it through quickly, given the medical urgency. Nadia's coverage is in place. What she needs right now is not money. What she needs is her parents walking through that door every single day, and her grandfather in the chair beside her bed, and her grandmother mending her socks by the window. Sabrina let out a long, unsteady breath. Both hands were pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were wet, and she was shaking her head slowly, the way a person does when they're trying to hold on to something that keeps sliding away from them. "Why," she said. The word came out muffled. "After everything we did to you, why would you do this?" I thought about the laundry room. Loretta setting the drawing on the tray table without a word. 5 figures in crayon standing in front of a building with 2 open doors. "Because she drew all of us on that piece of paper," I said, even when we'd given her every reason not to. Loretta reached into her coat pocket, unfolded the drawing, and placed it on the tray table next to the folder. Colin looked at it. Something moved across his face that I couldn't name precisely. Not shame, not grief. Something that lived in the space between the two. The place you arrive when you finally see with clear eyes what you have been doing, and cannot find any way to make that knowledge sit comfortably. He began to slide down from the edge of the bed. I understood what he meant to do. His mother had felt the same pull when she unfolded that drawing. It's what people reach for when language runs dry. The body steps in to carry what words won't hold. My hand found his shoulder before his knees could touch the floor. "Stay up," I said. "Sit back down. There's still work ahead of us." He settled back onto the bed. Both hands pressed together, dropped between his knees, his eyes fixed on them. Bevelyn's voice drifted in from the corner, measured and low. "He rang me at 11 at night," she said. "By 2 mortars in the morning, the 2 of us were in Dr. Chandra's office. He wouldn't close his eyes until every page was signed." Colin raised his head toward her. I don't think he'd remembered she was in the room. "She was the one driving," I said. "The truck was gone. I had no way to get anywhere. She took me out to Blue Hill Avenue to hand over the keys, brought me back, got me to the hospital, got me to the bank. The whole time she never once asked where we were headed or what for." Bevelyn gave a small shrug of one shoulder. "You'd have turned around and done the same for me," she said. "I would have," I said, without a second thought. Colin's eyes came back to me across the tray table, the folder, the drawing, and the 3 feet of space between us, and Nadia, sleeping with the monitors, drawing their quiet green lines beside her. He had something ready to say. Whatever it was never made it out. What surfaced instead was rawer and younger than anything I'd heard from him in a very long time. "The 30 the Salstas," he said. "The grant money. Did any of it go toward this? That money was never mine to spend on this," I told him. "It belongs to the community. Every dollar of it is still going to the community. None of it touched what we've been dealing with here." Colin absorbed that in silence. "Then what covers what's left?" I turned toward the window. Outside, Boston was pulling itself out of the dark, a pale gray seam opening up along the rooftops on the far side of Morrissey Boulevard, the first light of morning feeling its way in. "That," I said, "is something the 2 of us figure out side by side." The first thing Bevelyn did was put a post on the Dorchester Community Board Facebook group. She went up at 6:45 on a Friday morning. Before she published it, she came to me first. She arrived at the hospital around 6:00, well before visiting hours, though the night nurses on the pediatric floor had quietly stopped counting the clock for our family by the 2nd week. She sat next to me in the hallway just outside Nadia's door, phone in hand, and read the whole thing aloud before touching the button. 2 paragraphs. The first one said that Kenneth Pruitt, who had kept Pruitt's garage running on Bowdoin Street for 12 years, had a granddaughter named Nadia, 6 years old, receiving leukemia treatment at Boston Medical Center, and that the family was in a difficult stretch. The second paragraph said that the hospital's charity care fund was taking contributions on Nadia's behalf, with a link to follow in the comments. Not a syllable about the arguments, the house, the money, the long unraveling. Only the child, only the community, only what sat between those 2 things and needed bridging. She looked up when she reached the end. Does that work? And that works, I said. She posted it, tucked the phone away, and we sat there side by side and finished the coffee she'd carried over in a thermos from her kitchen. Now, I want to be straight about what followed, because the temptation is to round it up into something it wasn't. Plenty of people saw that post and did nothing. No reply, no share, no follow-through after the initial comment. That is the honest accounting. A meaningful number encountered it and kept scrolling. I hold no bitterness over that. I mention it only because the people who did move deserve to be measured against the real number who didn't, not against a softer version. The regular volunteers, the ones who had shown up at Pruitt's garage every Tuesday and Thursday for years, numbered 11. Mostly retired, most of them living within 6 blocks. Every one of those 11 put something into the charity care fund within 48 hours of Bevelyn's post. One of them was a man named Norbert. He had been untangling the garage's wiring and fixing its electrical problems at no charge since 2017. He walked into the hospital, carrying a card every one of the 11 had signed, pressed it into my hand in the hallway, gave me a firm shake, and left without any fanfare at all. The woman who ran the PHO restaurant on Morrissey Boulevard, she'd been routing her staff our way for reduced-rate repairs since 2018, sent money and a handwritten note. 4 words beyond the amount: "You fed us, we feed you back." Mrs. Waverly pulled together a collection from the parent community at Dever Elementary that came to $430. She arrived with it sealed in an envelope alongside a card the children had decorated, crayon drawings of soup bowls and cars, and a building that any one of those kids would have told you was Pruitt's garage, even if the roof sat at a peculiar angle. 430, 11 people, 1 faux restaurant on Morrissey Boulevard. That was the shape of what arrived. Not a wave cresting over us. Not a flood. Enough. A Tuesday brought the call from the Boston Foundation. The woman on the line was the program officer assigned to our grant orderly, and direct 2 qualities I respect in equal measure. She got to it quickly. The foundation had seen the community post, and before anything else, they needed to verify the standing of the grant funds. Specifically had the $30,000 set aside for Pruitt's garage, operational purposes, been redirected toward medical bills, personal expenses, anything outside the original scope. It had not, I told her. The treatment had been funded through savings I'd built over many years and the money from selling my own vehicle. The grant sat in the garage's account exactly where it was supposed to sit, reserved for equipment and programming, as the agreement spelled out. A pause. "I want to be candid with you, Mr. Pruitt. There was a question raised on our end about whether the garage's programs were still running, given the amount of time you've clearly been away. Every scheduled day since Nadia was admitted, the garage has been open," I said. "Bevelyn Crane has run the Tuesday and Thursday programs herself. The Saturday meal service hasn't skipped a single week." A second pause. "Mr. Pruitt, would you hold for a few minutes?" She was back in 4 minutes. "I've consulted with the grants committee. Their view is that full programming continuity has been maintained and the funds are properly placed. On that basis, they've voted to advance your renewal review. Normally that happens in September, but they'd like to move it to next month if that suits you. Same figure as the original award, another $30,000. Not on account of Nadia, because the work had kept going without pause." I thanked her, ended the call, and sat a moment in the corridor outside Nadia's room, phone resting in my palm. The renewal money, when it cleared, would flow directly to the garage, every cent of it on the terms the agreement required. But there was a provision written into Massachusetts nonprofit healthcare that I had since learned about community organization. Grants could be partially redirected to patient assistance when the organization and the patient shared a documented community tie. Nadia had been coming to Pruitt's garage on Saturdays since she was 4. Her name was in the volunteer logs. The charity care administrator confirmed the allowance up to 20% of a qualifying grant could be applied to patient assistance under those conditions. 20% of $30,000 is $6,000. That sum could travel through a proper channel and reduce what Nadia still owed, without pulling a single dollar away from what the garage needed to operate. I rang the charity care office and set the paperwork in motion before the day was out. Colin walked through the door of Pruitt's garage on a Wednesday, not arriving to pick a fight, not looking for anything he could use. He pulled up in the same car he'd been using as sleeping quarters on certain nights ever since he and Sabrina gave up the studio in Revere. 2 weeks back, they'd moved a sofa worth of themselves to Sabrina's cousin's place in Malden, temporary cramped, and the only option they had. He sat in the car outside for 10 minutes before he got out. Bevelyn was at the serving counter when the door swung in. She glanced up. Colin stood there taking in the room the way someone does when they've had a place wrong in their mind for years and are finally letting the real thing replace the version they invented. The folding tables, the people eating at them, the whiteboard listing the week's volunteer slots in Bevelyn's handwriting. Above the serving counter, a photograph from the first meal service in 2012. 12 people seated around 2 folding tables in an empty bay. Kenneth at the center sleeves pushed back. Colin studied it for a stretch. "I knocked over that table," he said. He made clear he wasn't aiming those words at Bevelyn in particular. He was releasing them into the room, putting them somewhere permanent. Bevelyn said, "You did." He didn't move. Both hands were shoved into his jacket pockets, and something had settled across his shoulders, a weight that was either brand new or had been there all along, and he'd finally quit the pretense of not feeling it. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. Bevelyn studied him, the way she studies a machine. Someone wheels in looking terminal, possibly salvageable, but only in the hands of whoever actually understands it. "There's a wrench on the bench," she told him. "Engine in the bay. Need somebody with the right knowledge behind it." "Your father's son." She went back to the counter. "Figure it out." Colin held the doorway a beat longer. Then he crossed to the bench, lifted the wrench, and disappeared into the bay. 5 weeks into the induction phase, Nadia's numbers turned. Dr. Chandra delivered the news with the measured hopefulness of a person who has long since retired. The word good from her vocabulary, too soon a word, too many times wrong. The blast cell count was falling. The protocol was doing what it was supposed to do. A long road still stretched out ahead, but they were now walking it in the right direction. And direction, she told us, was the whole game at this point. Nadia marked the occasion by asking for chocolate pudding from the cafeteria and sleeping through most of it. Life in that place had acquired a rhythm. Loretta was there before 7 every morning. I arrived at 8 once the garage was running. Colin showed up at noon. Sabrina came straight from her shift, still in her work clothes, pharmacy, name tag, riding her lapel. She pulled her chair up to Nadia's bed, took her daughter's hand, and didn't go anywhere. One Tuesday 5th week, I found myself alone with Nadia. Loretta had stepped away to phone her sister. Colin and Sabrina were out in the corridor, having the kind of conversation people have when they've finally stopped avoiding each other. I was next to Nadia's bed, her hand wrapped in mine. She'd been under for close to an hour. Most of my years have been spent working with my hands turning bolts, pulling engines, building things. A hospital room was what it took to show me that holding still next to someone holding on is its own kind of work. Nadia's fingers went first, then her eyes opened. Sleep let her go all at once, and her gaze found my face immediately, the easy certainty of a child who has come to know exactly which chair will have somebody waiting in it. She took me in. Then, "Grandpa." "Hey, sweetheart," I said. A pigeon dropped onto the window ledge outside, peered through the glass, and moved on. Nadia tracked it until it was gone. "Mommy and Daddy stopped yelling," she said in that voice of hers, the one that means she's been carrying something quietly and has only now decided to set it down. "I know," I said. "They hold hands now, like you and Grandma." My throat wouldn't cooperate well enough for anything more than a nod. She let her gaze drift to the ceiling, then brought it back to me. Loretta's dark eyes and that unflinching directness she'd had since she was too small to form full sentences. "Does that mean we're a real family now?" she asked. That question took up all the space in the room. I've cracked open engines that every other mechanic had written off, found what was broken, worked out the path, back to whole. But with Nadia's hand in mine, and those words still hanging between us, I couldn't locate a starting point for any kind of answer. Not from not knowing, from the answer being too large to hand to a 6-year-old in a hospital bed. I tightened my fingers around hers. She took that for what it was, the way children take things, without the suspicion that age teaches you, still willing to trust a hand that doesn't let go. "I don't mind the medicine so much," she said. Then after a pause, matter of fact, the tone of someone who has thought it through and arrived somewhere reasonable, "It's really not that bad." Her eyes slid closed again. I stayed, held her hand, didn't move. The afternoon light made its slow journey across the floor. The monitors kept their green rhythm. Something about the feel of the air changed on the other side of the door, and I noticed it before I understood it. I looked through the narrow window into the hallway. Colin had his back against the wall, head down, and his shoulders were doing what shoulders do when a man is pressing hard against something trying to get out. Sabrina stood next to him, with both palms pressed flat over her mouth, her face fighting itself. Every word had reached them. I turned back to Nadia, already gone again, hand resting loose in mine, breathing easy, entirely unaware of the damage she'd done to two people in the corridor just outside. A child, I thought. One question and one sentence about medicine, then back to sleep. I laid her hand carefully on the blanket, got to my feet, walked to the door and opened it. Colin peeled himself off the wall. Eyes raw, jaw locked, each breath drawn with deliberate control, the controlled breathing of someone navigating their way back from somewhere they hadn't planned to go. Sabrina raised her head from his arm. "Come in," I told them. "She's sleeping, but come in." They did. Colin took the chair I'd been using. Sabrina settled on the edge of the bed. Loretta came back from the family lounge, read the room from the doorway without a single word being exchanged, walked in and pulled the door shut behind her. 5 of us that room, Nadia asleep at the center of it. Colin looked at me over his daughter. He opened his mouth and nothing came. He pushed again. "Dad," he said, "there's something I need to say to you. Nothing to do with Nadia. This is about you. About things I should have told you years ago." Loretta moved to the chair near the window. Sabrina stayed on the edge of Nadia's bed, hands folded in her lap. I kept my place by the door. Colin leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and studied his own hands like he was reading something in them. "I want you to know what it looked like from where I stood," he said. "Not to excuse anything, just so you understand what I was dealing with." "All right," I said. The accounting firm had been running short-handed for 18 months. He'd been doing the work of 2 people out the door at 7 back home, after 9 ground, down to the point where thinking straight felt like trying to read in a moving car. Sabrina would be there when he got in dinner, ready, and a version of events that was always polished, always consistent, always aimed the same way. He'd been too spent to check it against anything, too worn through to push back. "My father doesn't value family." He'd heard it so many times, packaged so many different ways, that it had stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like something someone had looked up. "I'm not saying she forced my hand," he said. "I'm saying I didn't resist it. That's different, and I know it, and I knew it then too." He looked toward the garage. 12 years, and I never walked through the door once before that Wednesday. I went past it easily 100 times and convinced myself I had the measure of it. He went quiet. "I didn't." "No," I said, "you didn't. I came in and saw that photograph from 2012. 12 a people, 2 tables, you right in the middle." He stopped there. "I kept thinking about the voicemail, the one where I told you to clear out of your own house." A small, rigid movement of his head, not quite a shake. "I've been searching for the right word for what that makes me. I haven't found it." "Colin?" Not a reprimand, just the steadiness of a man who knows if he loses the thread, now he won't pick it back up. "I was in that kitchen when Sabrina pulled that plaque off the wall. I watched every second of it, and then I left. Not the voicemail, not the bills, not any of the rest of it. That moment right there, that's the one I walked away from." He pulled himself upright in the chair. "I should have put a stop to it. I didn't. That belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. I've carried the knowledge of it since that night and said nothing until this minute. I'm sorry, not because of Nadia, because of you, because of who I should have been standing in that kitchen." The room absorbed what he'd said and held it. I walked over and set my hand on his shoulder. He stayed where he was. A moment passed, and then his hand rose and briefly covered mine. No words, but something confirmed between us. I didn't say, "I forgive you," because it wasn't that clean, and neither of us would have believed it. What I said was, "You showed up. You keep showing up. That matters." He gave a single nod, settled both hands back onto his knees, and exhaled. From the window, Loretta said his name softly. "Colin." He turned to look at her. "Your father built that garage so you'd have something to look at. Not because he stopped caring about you, because he wanted you to understand what caring looks like when somebody practices it day after day." She paused. "It took longer than any of us would have chosen, but you're looking now." Sabrina rose from her seat and crossed to Loretta, crouching in front of her and taking both her hands. "I set a lot of this in motion," she said. Her voice carrying the steadiness that comes after everything worth crying has already been cried. The money I owed, the things I told Colin, what happened with the plaque that night. I was so locked onto what I believed we were owed that I couldn't see what was already being given. "I'm sorry. I'm not asking that to put anything right. I just need you to hear that I know what I did." Loretta regarded her for a moment. Then she tightened her grip on Sabrina's hands and said, "Stand up. Don't crouch on hospital floors. They're not as clean as they look. Sabrina made a sound that fell somewhere between a laugh and a sob, unable to decide which. She got to her feet. Loretta held on to one of her hands. I looked at the four of us, and at Nadia sleeping at the center of everything, and thought about the drawing 5 figures in front of a building, with 2 open doors, the smallest one in the middle, with both arms stretched out touching everyone else. She had drawn what she believed was possible. "There's work to do," I said. They looked at me. "Starting Monday, the garage needs another set of hands. You know enough about engines to make yourself useful if you keep your eyes open." I looked at Colin. "Can you do that?" "Yeah," he said. 7:30, I told him. "Don't come in late. Bevelin has no patience for it." Something shifted across his face. Not a smile exactly. Not yet, but the outline of one held in reserve for later. 7:30, he said. "I'll be there." I pulled a chair next to his and sat down. We stayed. Colin pulled up at 6:58 Monday morning. I know the precise time because I was fitting the key into the side door when his car came around the corner, and I checked the clock from habit. He stepped out in jeans and a flannel shirt, sleeves already rolled past the elbow. He had given thought to what a man wears when he shows up to work in a garage. That was not nothing. "The engine in the bay is a 2002 Ram 1500, I said. "Coolant leak, probably the intake manifold gasket. Tools are laid out on the bench. Parts came in Friday." I handed over the work order, read it through first, then opened the hood. "I haven't touched this kind of work since high school," he said. "You'll remember more than you expect," I told him. Hands hold onto things even after the head moves on. He got stuck twice that morning. Each time he appeared at the office door with a question, not something vague, but a sharp, specific question aimed at a specific problem. I answered and he went back under. By noon, he tracked down the leak, replaced the gasket, and confirmed it was holding. He came to the doorway. "It's not leaking," he said. "Good," I said. "Write it up." He stayed until 4:00. He was back Tuesday. 3 weeks in on a Thursday morning, I caught sight of Sabrina without her knowing. I was out front taking in a parts delivery when I saw her moving east along Bowden Street in the early gray of morning, the sky still holding on to the night at its edges. Work clothes, dark slacks, a collared shirt, the pharmacy name tag on her left breast pocket, hair swept back over one shoulder, walking at the pace of someone with a bus to make. She didn't see me. I stood there on the sidewalk with a box of parts in both hands and watched her reach the corner and round it and vanish. A woman who 3 months earlier had stood in that house and told me I wasn't real family walking to a bus stop before sunrise to work a job that paid by the hour. She wasn't doing it for my benefit. She had no idea I was there. That was exactly what made it count. I carried the last box inside. That same Thursday evening, I got to the hospital on the late side. I came down the hall and looked through the small window set into Nadia's door. The overhead lights were off. A lamp on the far wall threw a low, warm glow across the room. Nadia was in the bed with the blanket drawn up to her chin, eyes closed. Colin was in the chair beside her. He had a book open across his knee, the collection of stories about a bear and a fox that Loretta had kept on the bedside table since that first week. He was reading aloud in the quiet, even voice people use with a sleeping child. Not performing it, just continuing. His shoulders sat easy. His free hand lay along the side rail of the bed, not gripping, not bracing, just resting there, in the way a hand rests when it has made up its mind it's exactly where it should be. Nadia's lips held a faint curve. She was asleep, but she was smiling. I stood in the corridor and did not push the door open. I have been a mechanic the better part of my adult life. I know that a machine that has been running wrong for years doesn't right itself in a week. It rights itself in the hours nobody witnesses the slow settling of parts that have been brought back into alignment. Tolerance is easing toward where they were always meant to sit. The first morning, the thing turns over clean. I had waited 32 years to see my son be still enough to simply be present. He didn't know I was standing in that hallway. There was no audience for what he was doing. He was there reading about a bear and a fox because he had decided that was where he belonged. I released the door handle. I went back down the corridor and found an empty chair near the elevator bank and sat. The tiredness I felt had nothing to do with sleep. It was the deep kind that comes from holding yourself braced for a very long time and finally carefully beginning to let that go. For the first time since that evening at the Strand Theater, I felt something that didn't need a complicated name. It was relief, plain and uncomplicated. My phone buzzed. Dr. Elaine Chandra. I looked down the corridor toward Nadia's door, behind which my son was reading to my granddaughter by lamplight. Whatever the call holds, I thought this time we face it as one. I pressed answer. Dr. Chandra used the word good, not encouraging, good. The induction phase had done its job. Nadia's blast cell count had dropped below 1%, the threshold for remission classification under the COAG protocol. She would continue treatment on an outpatient schedule, consolidation, then maintenance for the better part of 2 years. But she could do it from home. She could sleep in her own bed. She could walk back into school in the fall. I stayed in that hallway chair until I was certain my legs would hold me. Then I stood up and went to find Loretta. The morning of the discharge was a Friday in early June. Dorchester, Boston, had given itself over fully to summer thick heat, the smell of food carts and bus exhaust layered in the air, and somewhere underneath it, the green of Ronan Park a couple of blocks away. We gathered without anyone needing to organize it. Loretta arrived first carrying Nadia's going-home clothes, the yellow one, with the toggles that Nadia called her bumblebee coat, clean jeans, the Velcro sneakers. Colin and Sabrina came in the same car, which meant they had left from the same place, which meant whatever was happening in Malden had moved beyond accident into something deliberate. Bevelyn brought flowers from her garden. Mrs. Waverly arrived with 4 children from Nadia's class at Deaver Elementary, carrying a banner of butcher paper that read, "Welcome back, Nadia," in letters of varying size and conviction, with cars and soup bowls running along the border. Dr. Chandra walked Colin and Sabrina through the outpatient schedule directly. She addressed them as Nadia's parents, which was the right call. Nadia sat on the edge of the bed in her bumblebee coat legs swinging. When Dr. Chandra finished, Nadia looked up at her and said, "Can I have one more pudding before I go?" The pudding was arranged. Nadia ate it with full seriousness. Then she climbed down, took Loretta's hand on one side and mine on the other, and walked out without a backward glance. Outside, the June air came in warm and easy. Nadia stopped on the sidewalk and tilted her face toward the sky and shut her eyes for a moment, registering something, fixing it in place. Then she opened them, looked at everyone gathered around her, and found the arrangement entirely satisfactory. Bevelyn pressed the flowers into her arms. Nadia said they smelled good and meant every word of it. Colin drifted away from the group and came to stand next to me at the place where the shadow of the overhang gave way to full sun. He looked out toward Morrissey Boulevard. When he spoke, it was in the way men speak when something needs to be released into the air between them, rather than said face to face. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Yeah," I said. He took a breath before answering, not hesitation, but precision. He wanted the words to land where he aimed them. "I'm done letting you shoulder this family on your own," he said. "The garage, the bills, all of it that changes now. I'm aware I've got ground to make up, but I'm making it." I gazed out at the bus lines and the pedestrians and the unremarkable rhythm of a Friday in Dorchester, Boston. "I know you are," I said. He dipped his chin. For a moment we just stood there, the city going about its business around us. Then Nadia pushed through between us, one hand finding mine, the other finding Colin's, and tilted her face up at both of us. "Are you guys okay?" she asked. Colin caught my eye over her head. I held his gaze. "Yeah," I said. "We're okay," Good Nadia said, "because I want to go see the garage." Something broke open in Colin's throat and came out as a laugh. I had not heard that sound from my son in a very long time. It was worth hearing. Riding back, Nadia squeezed between Loretta and me in the rear seat. "Grandpa," she said, "is the plaque still on the wall?" "It is," I said. "Exactly where you left it." She settled her head against my arm and said nothing more. Outside, Dorchester slid past in the long, warm light of that early summer evening. Morrissey Boulevard, the park, the bend onto Bowdoin Street, the garage ahead with its doors thrown wide. Light pouring from inside, pooling on the sidewalk in a warm rectangle against the darkening air. We were nearly home. Pruitt's garage has opened at 6:30 every morning for 12 years. Nothing about that routine shifts. Side door first, then the bay doors. Coffee on the hot plate. Lights up, one circuit at a time, because the third from the left has a personality and needs a moment to settle before it's asked to do anything. Run through the board, match the parts to the work orders. By the time the coffee is poured, the place is ready. I ran through all of it on the first Saturday of June, the same as every other Saturday across those 12 years, until I turned toward the wall and the plaque stopped me cold. It was right where it had always been. Nadia had put it back herself, not long after she mended it, same clear packing tape, her small palm pressing it flat against the concrete block. The fracture cut straight across the center, and in the morning light, pushing through the bay doors, the tape threw a bright seam across the brass face of it. Next to it hung a framed photograph. Colin had bought the frame and put it up without being asked. The first meal service, 2012. 12 people around 2 folding tables, me at the center, with my sleeves pushed up. I gave them both a long look. Then I poured my coffee and got to the board. Bevelyn walked in at 7. Colin arrived at 7:15 with Nadia, who had her bumblebee coat on, in spite of the June heat, and her art supply box tucked under her arm. She came through the door and made straight for the plaque, stood before it with both hands locked behind her back, head angled, giving her own repair a thorough inspection. "It's still good," she said. "It is," I said. She nodded once satisfied and went to claim her corner chair. Sabrina came at 7:30 carrying rolls from the bakery on Morrissey Boulevard, still giving off heat. She knotted on the apron from its hook by the door and got to work slicing. Loretta appeared at 7:45, drew coffee from my pot without ceremony, and took her place beside me at the serving counter. People started coming through the door by 8. I worked the counter. Colin was right there with me. The weeks prior had taught him the cadence of the thing, when to keep filling, when to hang back, how to read a face and know whether the person in front of you wanted a word or just their meal. He wasn't second nature at it yet, but he was picking it up without pretense, and that matters more than speed. In a quiet stretch, his eyes drifted across the room to the plaque. "She really did a good job with that tape," he said. "She did," I agreed. There was more I could have added, and I considered adding it, and then I let the moment carry what it already held. But I held the thought. I once believed family meant the people whose blood ran the same as yours. After that, I thought it was whoever slept under the same roof. I built my life according to both of those ideas, and both fell short in ways I didn't expect. What I knew now, standing at that counter with my son working next to me, my granddaughter in her corner, my wife a few steps down, was something with fewer moving parts. Family is whoever keeps showing up, not as a one-time gesture, not only when the cost is low. In a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, on a Saturday in June when there's work to be done, in every unremarkable day that strings between. That's the sum of it. Nadia turned up at my elbow. She'd set aside her pencils to watch the room instead, which was always where she ended up. "Grandpa." She said, "The line is getting long." I looked down at the bumblebee coat, the Velcro sneakers, Loretta's dark eyes in her small face fixed on me with the calm sureness of a child who has never doubted she was exactly where she belonged. "Right," I said. "Let's get moving." I turned back to the counter. Colin was already in motion. Loretta held the ladle. Sabrina worked through the last of the rolls. Bevelyn ran the room with the unhurried command she'd carried into this place for 10 years. Out on Bowden Street, the first Saturday of June rolled on. Summer light pressed through the bay doors in that slow, generous way it has crossing the floor, climbing the far wall, finding the plaque, the taped seam, catching it and holding. Nadia drifted back to her chair. I went back to work. I am a mechanic. My way of understanding anything is to open it up, find what's broken, and figure out how the pieces go back. Here is what 12 years of Pruitt's garage and 8 weeks in a hospital hallway put in front of me. The people who come back every single day, those are your family. Blood marks a line between people. It doesn't build what's between them. I spent 10 years writing checks in silence and calling that love. It wasn't. It was a man hiding from hard conversations behind the appearance of sacrifice. Don't follow me into that. Name the thing before the quiet hardens into something the people around you have to chip away at. God has a way of bending things back toward what they were made to be, even when we've worked hard to warp them. I've watched it happen. My plain belief, a man who bankrolls his family's life and waits to be honored for it has missed the point of being a father entirely. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I am grateful, genuinely. This story asked a lot of the people in it, and maybe of you too. I have thought about what this cost. Decades of showing up quietly, writing checks no one knew about, building something real in a neighborhood that needed it, and then watching the person who benefited most stand in my kitchen and tell me I was not family. That kind of wound does not close quickly, but I believe God does not let a man's honest labor go unreturned, even when the people closest to him fail to see it. The accounting always comes. It just arrives on a timeline we don't get to choose. Here is what I would want you to take away from Kenneth's story. First, do not fund someone's comfort in silence and call it love. Say what you are doing and why, or the sacrifice disappears into resentment on both sides. Second, a secret debt is not a private problem. It becomes everyone's problem the moment a crisis arrives. If you are carrying something hidden, put it on the table before life forces it there. Third, the people who show up in the hardest hours, not once, but every ordinary day between the emergencies, those are your family. Blood is a starting point, not a guarantee. Fourth, it is never too late to walk into the bay, pick up the wrench, and start from wherever you are. Colin did. It counted. This is the kind of family revenge story that doesn't end with a scorecard. It ends with a little girl asleep in the middle of a room full of people who finally figured out what they owed each other. For those of us in the adults 50-plus chapter of life, that image carries a particular weight. We have seen enough to know how rare it is. If this story reached something in, you share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment below, I read them, and your thoughts on what Kenneth did or didn't do, right, genuinely interest me. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Take care of the people in your house and the ones who show up even when they don't have to.